I would like to bring up our first in-person panel, who we have. And so we're going to be hearing from the Asian Black Solidarity Project, which is led by Asian Health Services and West Oakland Health Center. So I'm going to welcome Tu and Julia and Robert up to the stage. Thank you so much for being here. This is an incredible project. I think this is one of those things where it's a journey, it's a process, this project. We're not sharing findings. We don't have big research findings to unveil. But what I asked Tu and Julia and Robert to speak to was the how. Right? The how did they come together? What's the shared vision that they have, and how is that going? So I'll do some very quick intros, and again, you have their bios in the program as well. So Julia Liao is the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Asian Health Services. Tu Quach is the president of Asian Health Services, and Robert Phillips, right in the middle, is the president and CEO of West Oakland Health. So he gets both jobs. He gets both jobs. So this is Community Health Center family right here, right? This is Community Health Center family. Yes. So, and I'm a health person, so this is a very comfortable space. So I'm going to start with just an open question on, what's the origin story? What's the origin story for the Asian Black Solidarity Project? How did you all come up with this idea, come to be?
Yeah, well, so our origin story happened over 3 decades ago. So this is actually even before Tu, myself, or Robert were actually at our health centers. And what was happening was when Asian Health Services, we started in 1974, created by UC Berkeley students, any bears out there? And at that time, we were actually looking for stabilized funding. And the federal government was providing that kind of funding. And so when AHS actually approached the federal department that provided this funding, you want to hear what the response was? The response was, there will never be an Asian clinic.
In what year?
And so I think just even hearing those words, and I think there wasn't an understanding of the needs and the issues of our diverse community. In fact, the closest community health center was West Oakland. They said, West Oakland is fine. They'll serve everyone's needs. And so guess who came to advocate for AHS? West Oakland Health Council. And it was because of West Oakland Health Council who recognized that we absolutely needed diverse services, we needed the language access, and we needed to address the issues in a tailored way, that our community, as we all know, is not monolithic. And so because of their advocacy, that's why we're in existence today. And I think, yeah. And so if you kind of fast forward a little bit, we hit the pandemic, then there's George Floyd, and then anti-Asian hate, and this whole racial reckoning that was occurring. At the same time, we knew we had to respond, but not sort of react. And so we established a community healing unit, and big shout out to Ben Wang, our special initiatives director out there, of how do we address what was going on. Our staff, our patients, our community members in Oakland Chinatown had been attacked, had been assaulted, had been spat upon. And at the same time, as we were thinking about what does this look like in terms of response, we knew we were looking at the narratives that were going on out there. And we saw how the narratives of conflict were so much louder than the narratives of solidarity. Mm-hmm. And so that was when we had to think about our West Oakland Health Council partners, and sort of kind of thinking back and reigniting that commitment that we had to each other in the past, and really thinking about what does this look like as we move into this space of healing, and then thinking about how do we actually truly address the underpinnings of racism. And so that was how this began, and I'm going to turn it over to Robert to talk about the next leg of the journey.
Yeah, picking up on that, there's one thing to remember in this, and it informs the relationship, which is both Asian Health Services and West Oakland were founded to be trustworthy health options for their communities. And what I mean by that is, both communities experience unethical treatment and care, disrespect in treatment and care, unethical experimentation, or even just neglect and marginalization. And so both of us kind of come out of that space. That's why West Oakland can recognize not only Asian Health Services needs, but also its value and see it as an equal. And so this work started because both communities were experiencing violence. But the way it was being framed, to Julia's point, was as if that was not the case, and that the African American community's weight was to be more responsive to the violence in other communities than its others, rather than actually work in solidarity with communities. Sherry Hirota, who founded Asian Health Services, said that that's not our way. That's just not how we do things around here. That's not our perspective, that's not our history, that's not our experience. And so reached out, and with their own funding, said we're gonna start this project. And the project really is about two things. One, let's put some rigor to what actually is happening so we can understand, and do it in a way that is relational. Not just between the two communities, but between us. Like, build on our relationships. Yes, we're gonna do it as institutions, but we know each other. So we're gonna know how to not just ask questions with rigor, but also ask about the aspirations that we wanted. And then two, lean into the reason why we're here in the first place, which is to be about health. So the frame that we're gonna use is to see violence not as there's a bunch of bad individuals, but understand that as a health question, that means that there is context to what is happening and the different forms of violence that people are experiencing. And then do that in a way that asks questions in a way that might hurt each other, so we really understand. Let's ask the painful questions so we can really, really understand what is creating the perceptions and driving what could potentially be really deep divisions, but also the areas of specificity that allow us to kind of come together with each other. And then we had a researcher with us who was, like researchers can be, generals and taskmasters. How do we make that happen? I'll let Tu describe that.
So as the researcher, I, a proud researcher, but at heart, a community advocate. Most of the time when you hear about research projects, it's researchers thinking of an idea and trying to identify community partners. Here is two trusted community health centers that said, we're gonna do this in a community-based way, and then we're gonna identify the researchers that we wanna bring into this work. And so really, our focus was to really understand what are the attitudes, perceptions, and experiences of the Asian American community living in the area, as well as Black residents living in that area. And really, we had three things that we wanted to inform. The first being that we know so much was happening on violence against all communities. And so so much need around mental health, that we needed to inform the development of a mental health toolkit for the mental health professionals who are holding these survivors. And that's really critical because a lot of times maybe the training does not touch upon the racism that's happening and how to undo that, And then the second thing was really shifting the narrative. I think Karthik was talking about, we need to control this narrative. And we need to inform it with the lived experiences of these individuals. And the third piece was really to promote the solidarity that we knew always existed, but we needed to elevate it. And so those are the three arching goals for us. And we were able to do, a series of key informant interviews on both sides, as well as focus groups. So West Oakland, we kept working in parallel, right? We didn't have the exact same questions, but there were enough in parallel. So West Oakland was able to interview a lot of community leaders, as well as Black residents in that area and patients. On Asian Health Services side, we actually did focus groups with our patients. And I always like to say that we did the focus groups in language. We, of course, did it in English with our youth, but we also did it in Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Korean, Khmer, and Tagalog in separate groups with patients who have had different experiences living in that area. And so all of this informed how we're going to look at this. And so I wanted to share some of the early findings because we're still processing through a lot of this. The first one was, it was really interesting that both sides acknowledge and condemn the violence that was happening to the other community. For the Black community, they said, hey, what's happening with the increased violence against Asians, whatever the reasons, is wrong. It is just wrong. And then on our Asian side, what was really powerful for us to hear was they said, what happened to George Floyd was wrong. It was an abuse of power. We don't get to hear that too often with what's going on. So that was a really powerful finding for us. But then there was also the other things that both sides said, even though we live in the same area, we lack connection. We lack shared space. On some of the findings from the Black participants, they said, I don't know if the Asians want much to do with us. It's a transactional relationship, business and such. And then you hear on the Asian side, we can't speak English. We don't know how to speak to the other groups. And they're cutting our language classes. And so just to hear that was a really powerful moment for us to understand that. And then the other thing, which Robert and I will share a little bit more around, is as you're seeing what's happened all around, but it really came out after the pandemic was, and I think Pam talked about this, was food insecurity. So if you go to food distribution, you're going to see a lot of people in lines these days. Inflation, people are having a hard time making ends meet. And so they're at food lines. And a lot of times you see a lot of Asians and a lot of Asian elderlies at these lines. And they're trying to make ends meet. They're trying to not feed just themselves, but multi-generational households. But what we heard from some of the findings was that the Black community says they just come in the line and they take up space and they're not sharing. And that was what was being heard. And for us, we were like, oh yes, that's true, and yet we also know why. And so I think when those findings came out, we were like, we can't just observe as researchers. As a community health center, we need to act upon this. So we started forming joint food distributions where we're bringing these communities together. And already you can see some of the photos that were from some of these joint food distributions. Where it was intentional in February, we had both, we were celebrating Lunar New Year as well as Black History Month. And we intentionally went into our regular food distribution to highlight our cultural diversity and to celebrate each other and to create space for each other. And I'm going to turn it back to Robert to share a little bit more about some of that work.
Yeah, this finding was really important for us because, to Chu's point, the distance was creating a perception that was really based out of the lack of knowledge that we're talking about. So I'll give you an example. The Black community's perspective that the Asian community would come to any food distribution and then just kind of bogart space. It didn't matter what the neighborhood was we are welcoming to that community, but they're not welcoming to us. It gave us an opportunity to use the food distribution to actually educate folks on what that looked like. And so one story is there's a pastor who held this perspective. And he was like, why do the grandmas always come in here and just get aggressive? Like, why do they just push everybody out the way? So we go to Womancham Park to do joint food distribution and invite him to come with us during this program. And, we're bringing in joint art programming and our social programming as well as, health programming. And he gets to see the grandmas in their element, and they're worse with their folks than they are in the Black community. And he was like, oh, that's just the way they are. That's not about me.
Yeah.
And it was a deep lesson for us. Because of that lack of distance, people couldn't get that perspective and actually understand where it came from, because it also allowed our staffs to stand in space with each other and explain what that dynamic was about. Right? It was scarcity, and not just the moment, not an economic scarcity. It was, I have to come here and get it how I live as an immigrant. So when there's something available to me and I know I'm going to be pushed to the side, I have to advocate for myself. So I'm going to advocate for myself. It's nothing about you, nothing against you. It's not that I dislike you. I just need to get what I need to get. That was a perspective that wasn't able to be learned when we were standing outside. And without this research, it wouldn't allow us to actually create spaces that would allow that to happen.
I've heard them tell this story before on prep calls, and I'll ask it on this stage, is just, how did you do this? And because too, you mentioned some of the structural challenges, right? Not speaking the language, not having opportunity to interface across communities in natural settings. But you have done that through this work, and my question for you is, what's been harder than expected, and what have been some surprises, maybe what was easier than expected as you've done this work?
I guess I'll start. So what was harder, it wasn't so much about being in space with each other, right? Because we were building relationships and had familiarity. It was about being serious about it. And here's what I mean about that. So as you go through this research, and we were very intentional about not just hearing the things empirically, but pressing on the things that folks might not necessarily be honest about when you traditionally do research. And so, hearing things that hurt and sitting with that in relationship with your crew was hard. Because it forces you to actually stand outside of what your natural inclination is, which is to do something about it.
Right.
To not hear the perspective clearly, and not just sit with what is being found, right? Because these are findings. This isn't, somebody just kind of telling you your opinion. That was hard. An example is, one of the findings, and I won't give it specifically because I don't want to, step on, the statements that were made in the focus group. But the theme of it was around young Black men. That one, that they were the root of the problem. And then two, there was a sense that, these young men weren't raised. Like, do they have parents? Like, why are they acting this way? They're just wild. So for me, sitting in a room with sons, being that person from that community, knowing these young men, as well as young men from other communities, it's hard to hear to someone say, does someone raise you?
Right.
That's a hard thing to hear. And the purpose of it, right? To sit in that space and kind of understand where it's coming from, even though, it is a bit of a gut punch. To not immediately jump on the defensive, but try and understand it, was really, really hard.
Did you all have, how did you hold the space? Did you have people there to guide you through this conversation? Because you could also just walk away, right? You hear, and then you're like, you know what, that's too deep. You really don't understand me, right?
We had Sherry Hirota, and for those of you who know Sherry Hirota,
she'll keep you in the room. Yeah.
I think even we kept saying we're going to sit with the discomfort and be comfortable sitting with the discomfort. And that was something Robert brought up. Like, we're going to hear really hard stuff. And it was really hard. I want to honor the staff who did this work.
Absolutely.
You know, these are the same staff. You know, we're community health centers. We're not researchers. We don't have an army of researchers there. So what we do is we pull from talented staff who are connected to our patients, and we train them up. And so they were the ones doing the interviews. They were the ones doing the focus groups. And it was hard for them. I want to bring their voices in as they were doing the focus groups in Vietnamese, in Korean, in Tagalog, in Khmer, and hearing stuff that was hurtful. You know, many of them were younger. A lot of anti-Black statements that, you know, went against their own values and principles, and at the same time, very inspiring things. So for them, we needed to make sure that we brought some of the findings back to them and held space for them with each other. And then when the early findings did come out, and I think that part about the food distribution that we were kind of laughing about, but also it was hard as they heard that other communities may think that these elderlies are just pushy people. And they were like, yes, it's true, they're very pushy with us. And yet we understand that they've been through hunger, that some are refugees that have escaped so much. And so for them, it was like they wanted to just care for these individuals. But it was really hard for them to understand that this is the truth, and that they also knew the community so well to know why they behave that way. And so in bringing up that hurt and that pain for them that they're still processing through for all of us. But I think the good thing that came out with this is we knew how to be, to be uncomfortable with some of these truths that are coming out. And it wasn't binary. It wasn't like, oh, all Asians are anti-Black, all Black people didn't like Asians. It was really nuanced, and that there were so many gems that were coming out of these findings.
And I think it's those nuances that are so important because, as Robert said, they're very hard to hear, and as you're sitting in that discomfort, but it's really those nuances, it's those layers that you really have to get into to clarify. And it's so important to be able to do that because that's where the narrative change occurs. Because if you don't clarify the nuances, then you're not combating the fuel of fire of wedge politics. Because that's what's happening, because people try and create a binary structure, and yet it's not. And as you can tell, these are sort of on a continuum. There's so many of these stories. And as if we're hearing, well, how come the Asian community, when anti-Asian hate happens, why do the police respond right away? For the Black community, they haven't been responding. They've been waiting for decades for a response. And so I think that sometimes when you hear these things, it's very hard. But again, there's so much nuance in it. And so if we really want to think about how do we sort of shift forward and how do we construct what is our new narrative, we actually have to dive into that, what I love, what Robert says, interstitial space.
So what advice do you all have? I mean, we're all sitting in different places, in different rooms, and this whole day is about how we do this meaningfully. How do we collaborate cross-racially in a meaningful way? What advice do you have for folks?
So I would say there are two things. One is, the intentionality is also about creating structure. So it's any relationship, right? That there's an expectation to it, predictability to it. And so the way we did it was, we created a regular cadence when we knew we would see each other. And not just to kind of share findings and, think about the project that was in front of us, but it was also, creating a space to share some of the pain as well as some of, the excitement that we had about what we were doing. But it also gave us the ability to think about what we were doing together beyond the project. Like the project, yes, was the starting point. It allowed us, there's no way to kind of do it than to do it, right? So the way you get in a relationship is being a relationship. The project let us do that. But it also allowed us to think about our relationship with each other beyond just the work in front of us and be really, really intentional about that. And so we find ourselves now in other spaces really getting each other's back. So an example would be, there's a larger conversation now in Alameda County about violence. Those conversations tend to focus on the populations you would imagine, right? Black and brown populations, because that's what county governments do. It excludes, though, language in those conversations. So that means in the things that we know from the research that we found, it excludes our partner. So we find ourselves now advocating for our partner.
Yeah.
That the way in which you are thinking about the data, the way in which you're thinking and framing the problem, excludes the totality of the problem, the nuance of the problem. And it falls into a frame that is not only kind of, tried and hackneyed, but actually isn't real. Because that violence also is impacted by and perpetrated by more than just the folks that you imagine are doing it, right? Or victimized by it.
Did everyone hear that last part? Because that's pretty important in terms of how different narratives are being perpetrated, right? I think that that's just, yeah.
Yeah. I guess I would just add more to what Robert was saying was, we're seeing a lot of these requests for proposals come out from local government that specifically name communities of color, every one of them except for Asian Americans. And when we said, hey, why are we not named? Why are we not one of your priority populations? We've shown you data that shows our disparities. We've shown you the experiences. And a lot of it was like, well, the data we have does not show that you have disparities. And I'm like, your data sucks. We know that. And you admit that. So stop going back to that. But in these, I remember one RFP came out and it didn't name us. And I was like, forget it. I'm not going to apply. Why waste that? And West Oakland folks said, not only are you going to apply, we're going to help you apply. And that is about not just allyship, that is being in there with each other. And so I think the thing I would say is that whatever project that you get involved with, whether it's research, it's really about, again, the partnership and whatever you do, showing the full humanity of those that you work with. And so that's been the case. And because we're so much more than this research project, we have so many moments that we stand behind each other.
Absolutely.
And I would also say, just around sort of the humanity piece, that I think in some ways we have to think about how do we usher in sort of this new manner of empathy to create that relationship building that folks had talked about earlier, because it does create sort of that space where we can sit in discomfort, be honest, sit in conflict, and have that dialogue. And I think now we're in this era where there's things that it's like very immediate, Amazon now, we are always trying to, and we're looking at extremes and where do we have space for that type of dialogue? And I think until we can have that and be very honest with each other, it's not until then that we can actually really think about how do we create that mutual support and then also that mutual respect. And then how do we shift up and do mutual advocacy? And so I think that's really key, is how do we get to that place? And it takes work. And as Robert said, it takes intentionality. I wanted to just share, for our own staff. So West Oakland is, a 5-minute drive from Asian Health Services. And yet none of our staff had ever visited West Oakland. And so we realized we have to create that intention and go over there and be in community with each other. And again, I think that's where you start to create these sort of tiers of support for each other and understanding.
Incredible. Thank you all for sharing. And as I mentioned, it's not easy, right? And Julia, I love what you just outlined in terms of there's layers of a process that you work through in order to even be able to take collective action together. It takes, you can't just jump to that. We have a few minutes for questions, maybe one question or two, depending on how long it is. So one question out there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Vaughn Villaverde. I'm Director of Advocacy at ACCI. which is another community health center based in San Jose.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go back to your point about engaging in this community-based participatory research, really by training up staff and training up all the like the frontline workers. And at ACCI, we would absolutely love to do this, but if I'm being honest, our staff is stretched very, very thin. There's a lot of changes happening in the healthcare world, in behavioral health, and we feel like our staff is like hanging on by a thread, and any kind of rocking the boat, we'd see like a huge kind of surge of folks leaving for the Kaisers and the Stanfords and the Sutters of the world. And so when you're talking about...
There's some Kaiser folks here, sorry.
I'm going to be honest, you guys pay so much more than we pay.
All right.
Yeah, there isn't. You guys just pay people a lot more than the community clinics can, if I'm being honest. So I guess my question is that what are your insights in terms of carving out this space, carving out the capacity to engage in this kind of participatory research, given that the demands of these frontline staff are already stretched so thin, and we're scared of just losing more staff in this labor market?
That's an excellent question.
We're just laughing because the workforce crisis is on all of our minds, right? And there's burnout factors, there's recruitment and retention, and so all of those are very real. And as a community health center, we also agree that people don't come to work for us because of just the pay. They come because of the mission. And they come because it's serving communities that are their own communities or patients that are like their parents and them when they were first immigrants. And I, as an epidemiologist who has done the intense data analysis and then also the qualitative analysis, when we mobilize our staff, who we didn't think would be interested, case managers and such, we actually are giving them an opportunity. And so it's skills building. And so while it feels like it's more work, not every duty is the same. And for those, even those who were like, oh, I don't know if I have time for this, to recruit is so much, I'm a patient navigator. I remember walking on the street and running into one of the staff, and she said, the day before that focus group, when I had to run the Tagalog group, I was so nervous, I couldn't sleep. And she said, and then when I heard what they said, I felt so inspired, and I wondered why we aren't doing this more. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, it's giving an opportunity for them to connect back to why they work at a community health center. So it's not an easy answer to what you say, but it is finding the reason why we do the work that we do.
Yeah. I would echo that. And I would say it, in some instances, for some of our staff, and I'll just give an example of a young maternal health outreach worker. Her press was she wanted to talk to more of our folks. Loved the care she was providing, loved the way she was engaging, and she just wanted to be more outside of the clinic. And so this was an opportunity for her to do that. I don't know, to your point on the retention question, had we not responded or had a project like this to be responsive to that demand, because it was a demand from a young woman who came here with that idea in mind, I don't know if we've been able to retain her. Because you're right, everybody is up against it. And, these are folks doing hard work. You know this better than anybody else. Folks don't come to clinics just to do rote professional medical work. And so I think that's something we've had to tap into as well. Because, as Tu said, we feel it acutely. The workforce stuff is a real thing. And so this has also forced us to be thoughtful and more flexible about what it is that actually feeds them professionally.
And I would just say, kind of as a last comment, it does require support, requires partnership. And so when we think about if we want to see these type of relationship building, the partnerships, the solidarity, there has to be an investment.
Absolutely.
And that investment has to come on many levels, from the funding perspective, from the city, from the county. It requires that type of, again, support. So I would encourage all of us to be thinking about what does that look like from where you sit and where you stand, and what that investment can really, again, foster these type of relationships. Again, we do get some funding for that. It does require a lot of creativity with our workforce, but again, we can't do that without some level of support.
That's what's up, Julie.
Well, I would just ask everyone to join me in thanking Tu and Robert and Julia for sharing today. This work that you're doing is localized to Oakland, but the benefits already are going to be huge for our community, for the API community, the Black community as well. It's a gift, what you're working on. So thank you so much for spending the time, sharing, and for doing this great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.